All right, today we're going to be talking about the New York City Marathon and an overview of the course and a strategy for approaching the course. Now, this might be a longer video, and so I'm going to try to put timestamps in here and so you can jump to the parts that make the most sense. What I want to cover are some key moments, and there are 8 key moments in the race, I think. Some key factors to think about as you show up on race day and get ready to run the race. And then I also want to put in some interesting historical notes about the marathon since it's been around for the last 52 years. And so that's sort of the plan for approaching the race today, and that's what we're going to go do. But to start with, so where does all this information come from? I have first drawn from my personal experience running the New York City Marathon. And additionally, there's a lot of great books about running out there. And here are just 3 that I've looked at. But when you read these books and a lot of the pros talk about their approach to the race, you can get a lot of information about the different race strategy and their race preparation that we can also use for us amateurs as we approach running the race. All right, so with that, let's hop into it. So this is a Strava map of the course. And as you can see, the New York City Marathon is a point-to-point course. It starts down here on Staten Island. It's going to run through Brooklyn and then Queens, into Manhattan, up into Harlem, and back down and finishes in Central Park. And so that is the race course as we know it today. However, it hasn't always been that way. So when the race first started in 1970, it actually all took place within Central Park. And so laps around Central Park. I used to live in New York back in the day, and I think it's like it's basically like a 10K. To run around the full outside of the park. It's very hilly as well, especially in the back. And so that was the beginning of the course. But starting in 1976 is when the famous organizer, Fred Lebow, changed the course to be more of a tour of the 5 boroughs of New York City. Huge promotional, what a cool concept, right, to do that. And so that's the modern course that we have today. Although there were a couple things that have changed in the course since it first started in 1976, but we'll get to that when we get to that moment of the race. All right, so let's talk about the race itself. As I mentioned before, there are 8 key moments in the race course, and I want to talk about them in particular. And it first starts with the start of the race. So when you run this New York City Marathon, you're going to start all the way in Staten Island. And later on, we're going to talk about how do you get to Staten Island, the start of the race, and how that's a key factor. But for the first key moment, it starts with the race as we are in the first mile. So in the first mile of the race, you are running over the Verrazzano Bridge to get from Staten Island to Brooklyn. And to do that, you can see it on the elevation chart here. I'm going to zoom out a little bit, but that's basically it. On the elevation chart here, you can see that this is the highest point in the entire race. And so for the first race, you are essentially running straight uphill. And when you look at the elevation map, you're going from basically 0 up to over 100 feet of elevation. And the grade can be pretty steep. It can be 3-4% the grade as you go up this thing. But the problem is, it's not going to feel like you're running up a hill because you're going to be so amped and excited and pumped that you're at the New York City Marathon. You're going to be waiting for so long, you've trained for so long. New York's going to be playing. You're going to be excited. And so it's not going to feel like a big hill, but it is a big hill. And you can go way too fast. And so as you think about this point in the course, keep in mind that if you have your goal marathon pace, that first mile should probably be slower than the goal marathon pace because you are running up one of the biggest hills in the entire race course to start the course. And so you don't want to expend too much energy too quick. At the same time, once you go up the hill, which is about the first mile, the second mile is you come back down the bridge as you're going into Brooklyn. And this is going to be a much faster part of it. And so if you can keep in your head and your mind that that first mile will be slower and not to psychologically let that bother you, you can make it back up in the second mile and then enter when you start Brooklyn for your next stretch of the race. You can be back on your race pace. But don't go too fast over the beginning of the hill. That's your first key moment in the race. The second key moment in the race is when you now have gone over the hill and you're now running through Brooklyn and Queens. And to be honest with you, this is a very long, uneventful stretch of the race. It goes from mile 2 all the way through mile 15, beginning of mile 15, so 2 through mile 14. And not a lot's going to happen. It looks like hills, but they're all pretty quick, and it's more just sort of rolling hills. And none of these things are particularly high or particularly steep. They're just sort of kind of rolling hills as you go through Brooklyn and Queens. A couple things to kind of mix up the feeling in your legs, and so it doesn't feel like a pancake flat course like Chicago or London. So you get some rollings, but none of these hills are at all anything to worry about. And so really this is your chance to hit your marathon pace, dial into your marathon pace, and just cruise. Find a group of runners and cruise. It's going to be crowded in the beginning because this is when the different runners from the different starting points in the Verrazzano Bridge are going to start merging together. But it is going to be an uneventful part of the race where you can just sit back, dial into your race pace. In terms of training, think about that. Think about that you are going to have a period on your long runs where it's not flat, where it's going to be kind of undulating, and that's going to mimic the period around Brooklyn and Queens, which is going to be a very big part of your race. The third key moment in the race happens at mile 15. And at mile 15, what you're now doing is you are going to be leaving Queens, and you're going to be crossing the Queensboro Bridge into Manhattan. And this is mile 15 to 16. Well, mile 15. And this is a really cool section of the race because all through Brooklyn and Queens, what you're going to find and what makes New York City Marathon so exciting is that you're going to have a lot of spectators out there cheering. It's cool. The roads are going to be packed. People are yelling and screaming, and it's very motivational. But when you hit the Queensboro Bridge, there's this weird, eerie silence because there's not spectators allowed on the bridge. And so for this mile-long stretch, it's very quiet. And you can hear your footsteps, you can hear your competitors breathing, and it's a really eerie kind of cool feeling, though. But remember, on a bridge, it's also going to be elevation. And so you can see here, starting at about mile 15, as you're going over this bridge, you're going to start, hitting a little bit of right here, you can see there's a little bit of a hill going over the bridge itself, but it's not crazy, right? It's not like the Verrazzano Bridge. It's like a 3% grade very quickly. And so the challenge of the Queensboro Bridge isn't so much the elevation, it's just the change in not having motivation of the people and the spectators cheering for you for a while. So that's the third moment. The fourth key moment of the bridge is one of the most fun parts of the race, and that is when you come off the bridge, you're going to make this kind of loop-de-loop turn. You can see here, as you come off the bridge, you're going to be taking this little loop-de-loop turn to end up now running down First Avenue for miles 16 through 17. And this is such a cool part of the race because there's going to be this huge contrast to the eerie silence you had on the Queensboro Bridge to when you hit First Avenue, and you'll hear it coming. It's thunderous. There are so many people that are going to be out on First Avenue cheering. It's got to be the loudest section of the race. Everybody talks about it here, and you just get super pumped up, and you can have a moment that can harm your race. And this is a critical moment in the race because you're going to have so much energy from the crowd. You're going to want to run really, really, really fast. And if you look at the elevation of the course map, it's favorable. There's a lot of downhill sections along here where you can really open up your legs and start running. But you need to be careful and not to get carried away with running too fast for this particular mile and a half stretch down First Avenue because it's going to hurt you later on in the race. There's still a lot of running left to go do. And there's so many accounts in these books of the pros getting carried away and fading later on in the race. And so even though you're going to have so much energy, you have to be careful not to start running too fast during the First Avenue stretch. You're going to feel good, but it's going to be artificially good because you're getting pumped up by everybody out there. Okay, the next key section, the next key moment of the race, the fifth one, is when you get done with First Avenue, you're going to start entering Harlem. So you're running over like a little bit of a bridge here. You get into Harlem. And this is right around mile 20 of the race, right around here. And what's important to realize is that there's a couple really nasty little hills here, in particular, right at mile 20, right when you are approaching the wall of a marathon, you get hit with a real nasty 4% hill. It's like right around here. And what you want to remember is just realize that these things are short and you're not going to be feeling good. You're starting to maybe run into a tough part of the marathon and you get hit with this hill. Keep in your mind that this is temporary and it's not a huge hill and you can get over it. But it's a nice shock to the system because right when you're feeling potentially starting to feel your worst, you get hit with this nasty hill and you get to Harlem. Get through it. Get through Harlem, make the turn, and you're coming back into Manhattan for the next key moment of the race, which is now you're coming down Fifth Avenue. So you come back into Manhattan, and you're running miles 21 through 23. So you're running about 2 to 3 miles back in Manhattan. Now you're coming down Fifth Avenue. And I think the hardest point of the race happens in this section, and it happens specifically at mile 23. So between mile marker 23 and mile marker 24. And what's going to happen, you can see on the elevation map, you're coming down Fifth Avenue, and right here, right at mile 23, for the next mile, you're going to be running uphill at a 2 to 3% incline for the entire mile. And this, in my opinion, is the hardest point of the entire race. It isn't a huge hill, but it comes at a point when you're very, 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 very tired. And it's easy to let your pace slip during this moment of the race. And so one of the things that I would say is when you do your training, when you do your long runs, try to incorporate that last stretch of your long run to account for this mile that you're going to experience on Fifth Avenue, right around mile marker 23 to 24, where you're going to have to start running uphill, and you're going to have to deal with this long, steady incline for an entire mile. It can be very challenging, very demoralizing, because all you want to do is be done, and you're hit with this extremely hard mile. But get through that, and you hit the seventh key moment of the race, which is now you're in Central Park. So you enter Central Park right around mile marker 24, a little before mile marker 24. And in the park, you can see there's a lot of bumpy elevation because you're going to go over a bunch of hills. Nothing too big, though, right? It's just kind of up and down as you run through the park. Nothing crazy. But you're coming through the park. But this is a challenging section because for memory, this is also a section where you don't have as many spectators as you're used to. It's a lot more sparse because of security as they're locking things down for the race. And so it's a challenging section because it isn't a flat part of the course. It is a rolling part of the course. You're tired. You just get destroyed going up the Fifth Avenue hill before you get into the park, and there aren't a lot of spectators. And so as you think about the course, keep in mind that it's going to be a challenging section because you're not going to be able to pull off the crowd. But this all starts to change for the last key section of the race, which is you're working your way through the park, and then right here, right around mile 25.7, so you have maybe half a mile left. You make this turn at Columbus Circle, and now you're heading the opposite direction towards the finish line. And here you're going to hear a lot of people cheering for you, and it's going to feel awesome because you're making this turn at Columbus Circle, and you only have, 0.2 miles left at the finish line. Now, it is not a easy stretch. In fact, the last very part of the stretch is uphill, and you can see you hit a 3% grade. And if you watch any historic races, you can always see that there's often a sprint finish between some of the elite people, and it's challenging because it's an uphill finish. So don't let that deter you. Just feed off the energy of making that turn at Columbus Circle. You're so close to being done. It's cruel that it's an uphill finish, but there aren't a lot of turns. You just kind of run hard, and then you're going to run hard. You're going to finish, and you're going to finish in Central Park, which is super exciting. And congratulations, finished the New York City Marathon. So I know that is a longer recap, but I'm hoping that helps you as you think about how you approach the course and how you approach about designing your training to tackle key moments in the course. Again, I believe there are 8 key moments that you should mentally prepare for. Make a checklist about how you're going to approach it. The Verrazzano Bridge, the Brooklyn Queens section, going over the Queensboro Bridge, First Avenue and how you approach that mile, the Harlem Hills, mile 23 on Fifth Avenue, the Central Park and the lack of spectators and the undulation, and then finally the turn and the stretch to the finish line right after Columbus Circle. Those are the 8 key moments in the race. Now, the last thing I want to mention are some key factors to think about. And I made a separate video about this that you can watch. I'll put a link here. And this is just some things that I wish I had thought about before I had run the race. But here are a couple things about it. The first one to think about is that notice that on the course, you kind of change directions where you're going kind of maybe this direction, you come back around. And so the point of this is that the wind can come into factor here. Some years you're going to have a tailwind. And if you have a tailwind that's blowing kind of from the south to the north, you're going to feel good for a long part of it. But eventually it will turn into a headwind. And it's going to turn into a headwind at the worst possible time during the end of the race. And so pay attention to the wind and just know that it could turn on you when you don't want it to. Moreover, you start the race on the Verrazzano Bridge, and it's a very open section where you're out over the water. And so you're probably going to get hit with huge gusts of wind when you start the race. And so keep in mind how you might deal with that. Maybe you're inside the pack of runners. Maybe you're not trying to be on the outside. But the wind can be a factor there. The second thing is that there are so many people that run the New York City Marathon. And so at the beginning, it will be crowded. They do a good job having staggered starts where some people start on the top of the bridge, some people start on the bottom. But eventually it kind of merges together. And it's a little bit disconcerting, I think, when you first run the race to see all these people kind of running what looks like a different course. And you're like, how does that work? And eventually they do merge back together when you're in the Brooklyn section. But just know that there are a lot of people. You're going to have a point where everything kind of merges together. And you're going to see a lot of different people running what looks like a different course, but it all works out. The third key factor is, the reality is because it is a huge marathon and because it is a point-to-point race, you're going to have to start on Staten Island. And it involves transportation to get there. Whether you take the ferry, buses, or something like that. But more importantly, it involves a lot of waiting around. And it's in November in New York City, so it can be cold. Really think about what you're going to do preparation-wise before you start the race. What are you going to wear? What's your hydration? What's your food? What are you going to do to stay entertained? How are you going to stay warm? Because you will likely be at the start of the New York City Marathon a lot longer than at a smaller race. It could be an hour, 2 hours. It could be, maybe longer than that. So think about that and make that a very important part of your nutrition, hydration, and race planning strategy in order to make sure that you start the race in your most effective way possible. So a couple key factors to think about. With that, I will wrap up. I wish you all the best of luck training and racing for the New York City Marathon. I certainly hope that this video helps as you logically break down how you're going to run what is such a cool race and such a memorable experience. And I wish you all the best of luck chasing your New York City Marathon running goals.